event. And therefore, I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker, Shunya Kimura, who's a PhD student at UCL, and he's all about gambling. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming and making time for my presentation. Let me just crack right into it. So the title is Unveiling Online Gambling Behavior, a Descriptive Analysis of Consumer Data. So I'll be looking at consumer data and trying to understand gambling, online gambling in specific in general. Next slide. So here's my contents. So I'll go over the research background, the context, and then describe more about the data that I'm using. And we'll deep dive into the customers that is involved in this online gambling and activity types that they play and their patterns of play. And then I will go over some of the further analysis that I've done and summarize everything at the end. Just as a transparency, there's a conflict of interest. I just wanted to put it out here that I'm co-founded by ESRCU's UBEL Doctor Training Partnership and Gambleware. But my data that I'm using at this research is provided by an anonymous gambling operator. They have no say on research design, and output checks are conducted prior to research sharing. And these output check includes make sure that no sensitive data is disclosed, such as their financial information or some sensitive data about the customers. So just to go over the research context, I just want to compare survey data and consumer data. Survey data has been used extensively in the past gambling research, but I argue that there are there are flaws that comes with survey data naturally. For example, measurement error, especially in the context of gambling studies, because it is self-reported, it might be prone to social desirability bias, especially when it comes to something like gambling. A lot of stigma is around, and people may not want to disclose their actual behavior. Selection bias is another thing where these surveys are conducted from online survey, which attracts techie savvy population. So it might lead to the selection bias. Survey data tends to be high in cost, which leads to small sample size, which makes it difficult to do subgroup analysis because of the small sampling fraction. So if you want to look and disaggregate into different geographical smaller areas or different demographic groups, that becomes tricky to conduct a robust subgroup analysis. Whereas consumer data, it has large sample size, spatially and temporally granular, and it has a potential to reveal accurate patterns of play. This is what I'm trying to present throughout this presentation. My ultimate motivation for this research is to create a typology of online gambling behavior using data-driven approach, which is transparent and also open to scrutiny. And at the end, I would like to produce potentially new ways to conceptualize and measure at-risk online gambling behaviors. Now let's look into data description and coverage. So the data that I'm looking at is the entirety of 2022, from January to December. The geography includes England, Wales, and Scotland, Great Britain. Now, I have not, even though I have access to the entirety of the customer from this anonymous operator, I've subset it to these genuine customers who have met the condition of these two, engaged in gambling using their actual money, which excludes their free bet play. And also, they must have made multiple deposits and met this condition for multiple days throughout the year in 2022. That has left us with 1.2 million genuine customers across Great Britain in 2022. And they have made 270 million bet slips that was transacted across Great Britain 2022. And these customers made 80 million gambling sessions played across Great Britain in 2022. So this is the data that we're looking at. And I have organized this gambling data into bet slips and gaming sessions. So bet slips is defined as something that can be recorded by bet slips. That includes sports betting mainly, but it can include politics, and people can also bet on TV shows. Gaming is something that is organized, everything else that can be organized by sessions. So that includes poker, casino, bingo, and so on. I've defined gaming sessions by looking at the transactions. If there are more than 30-minute gap between each transaction, then the next transaction will be defined as a new session, start of the new session. Now we're looking at the data coverage. So the proportion of the online gamblers, 84% come from England, 11% come from Scotland, and 5% comes from Wales. And this is broadly proportional to the Great Britain adult population, as you can see in brackets. And these customers cover more than 3 in 4 Great Britain postcodes, and they cover 100% of the Great Britain local authority district. Now we can look at the customer penetration map. Customer penetration map is how much of the Great Britain population this operator managed to reach. So on the left is a table of penetration rates by regions. On the right is the map of customer penetration rates across the Great Britain by local authority districts. So northeast and northwest has a high penetration rate of around 4%, below Glasgow City, around Middlesbrough, County Durham. It is well spread out, but there is no clear patterns of urban or rural distinction. There is slightly some patterns of some coastal cities having a higher customer penetration, like Liverpool, Portsmouth, Ipswich, Boston, and so on. Now let's look into customers and their activity types. So from the data, we can plot the timeline of when these customers registered. These spikes can be attributed to major events such as Grand National, Champions League, Final, Europa League, Virtual Grand National. Most of them are happening in the UK, and you can say that the gambling operator's promotion has also caused this spike as well. So there's these big events are major motivations for people to join online gambling in the first place. Now I've also plotted a cumulative relative frequency plot of when they registered. So 30% of the customers that we have registered within 2022, meaning that we don't have their full data within 2022. This is one of the unique characteristics of using consumer data sets. Because it is updated regularly and frequently, we have to repurpose these consumer data to meet our research motivation. There are ways to account for this, such as removing all of these customers we don't have full data on, but we decided to keep them by being creative about the variables that we produce from these customers. Just as an example, 3.5% of the customers are registered for more than 10 years. You can call it veteran customers. 37% have registered for more than 1.5 years. Now I've broken down betting and gaming. The participation rate of customers by these different activities of betting that we have identified. There are 13 different betting activity types that customers can bet on. Most of them are football, and horse racing is very popular amongst bettors. 64% bet on football and 53% bet on horse racing. And it's interesting that less than 20% bet on the rest of the sports. So it is highly focused on football betting. If you look at gaming, there's 11 gaming activity types that we have identified. And you can say that it's more distributed well. So customers who game tends to play a variety of different products. And just to explain the columns, they are all entire customers, the ones that only bet, not gamed. Third column is the ones that only gamed, not bet. And the fourth is the ones that participate in both. And it's quite interesting to look at the gaming exclusive customers who play slots. Majority of 82% of the customers who only bet on gaming tends to participate in slot. Now we can look at demographics. So who are these online gamblers? This population pyramid is normalized by Great Britain population. You can see that online gambling is popular amongst the youth, 29-year-old to 39-year-olds, especially between 30 to 34 years old. And you can see that there is a disproportionate balance between the male participants and the female. Having male online gambling tends to be dominated by male, which reflects the past findings from the surveys. What we can do with this data is we can disaggregate it by different activity types. So whether these different activity types attracts different demographics. If you can look at golf, for example, golf attracts much higher population, higher age population, the peak being 55 to 59 years old. Whereas if you look at basketball, for example, it is very much focused on the youth. So you can see this clear distinction between different sports. If you look at gaming, now distribution completely changes again, having the age, gender disparities is now almost equal with male participant of male and female online gamblers. So instant wins is one of the gaming activities. This is proved to be popular amongst both genders. I just want to highlight here that this is some interesting finding that we could only look through this kind of data. And it is a very important finding because it shows that different activity types attracts different demographics. Now we can look into patterns of play. Using the transaction data, betting slip data, the gaming sessions data, and also the data where people have deposited and withdrawn money from their accounts, we have identified 37 different variables, which reflects 4 key themes: frequency of play, intensity of play, variability of play, and riskiness of play. Variability, just to be clear, it's the fluctuation of certain gambling behaviors. Are patterns consistent or not? We believe that from these 4 key themes, we can identify and characterize how people bet online. So this is the frequency. These are the general variables which relates to the entire customer. And the columns are split into entire customers, the ones that only betting exclusive, the ones that only get gaming exclusive, and the ones that participate in both. So these are 7 frequency variables that we have identified. I'm just going to highlight the interesting number, which is the variable called proportion of gambling active days. And this is how much proportion the customer has been active during the time that they were registered. So if they were registered for the entire year, what proportion of the 2022 were they gambling active for? If they were registered for less, then what proportion of their activity were they gambling active? So 12.4% is the median. But then if you look at the participating in both customers, that jumps to 21%. Perhaps this indicates that if you bet and game at the same time, then you're likely to spend a longer time throughout the year that you're participating in online gambling. Perhaps that is reflecting that someone might gamble on sports, and then in the meantime, where it is an off-peak hour, off-peak season, maybe they participate in gaming. Perhaps another interesting number here is proportion of popular day plays. So popular day I defined as being the top 75 days in terms of participant count, because depending on what events are happening, depending on what promotions they're on, there will be popular days. So I'm looking at if these players tend to play on these popular days selectively or not. The median value is 33%. So 33% of the popular days, general customers tend to gamble. But if you look at the betting exclusive customers, that jumps to 52%, sorry, meaning that perhaps it reflects how betting is driven by different events. And that's why these betting exclusive customers particularly bet on these popular days where big events might be happening. Now, these are some variables that I've selected for intensity. I just have to note here that some are the ones that you see with the pound sign on. For example, the average monthly deposit amount, the average deposit amount per deposit days, average stake amount, everything was converted into ratios because we could not disclose this information because it might lead to the sensitive data to be disclosed. So I've converted to ratios, having that all customers being the baseline and comparing the proportion of these variables across different types of gamblers, groups of gamblers. I've highlighted one, for example, average stake amount per gambling days. So how much did an average customer spend on their day that they gamble. So the gaming exclusive customers, those that only game, has a 3.8 times higher amount that they stake per gambling days. And that is much lower compared to betting exclusive and the ones that participate in both. We can also look at the variability of play. That includes standard deviation of the gap between deposit days, proportion of weekend plays, and so on. Riskiness of play, I have calculated, for example, monthly loss deposit ratio, which is essentially how much they've put on, how much they've lost from their pockets versus how much they've put in money into the accounts from their pockets, the ratio between the two. That may indicate one's tolerant to risk. Are they able to manage losses? Are they managing it well? And so on. How much they're willing to lose. So these are identified as the riskiness. I will come back to this variable in the later slides. Now we're back to intensity, but we need to highlight that there are some betting specific and gaming specific variables because of the differences by nature, how these two are played. For example, because betting are collected by betting slips and gamings are collected by sessions, these variables differ by nature. For example, average session interaction, average session duration, that is the only variable that we can get through gaming. That doesn't exist in betting. So average session duration is how much they spent on average on a gaming session. Interaction is how much they've interacted with, how much they had to interact. So slots will have a higher interaction, whereas the poker, for example, will have lower session interaction. Variability of play, there are these variables. Riskiness of play, there are something that is specific to betting. For example, average proportion of ACA bets, accumulation bets, that is only derived from a betting specific one. Average potential return per bet, so how much they are willing to risk compared to the return that they get. So these variables we can only get from betting. Now we wanted to look into each of these variables and see if they vary depending on different activity types, just as we did with the demographics. One of the examples that we've done is average stake size per play. Does that differ by different activity types? So meaning that do they spend different amounts depending on different games, different activities? And the top light blue plots are showing the betting activities, whereas the lower darker blue plots are showing the gaming activities. And you can see instantly that there tends to be quite constant across the betting groups. However, when you look at the gaming one, it varies quite a lot. For example, bingo has a very low average stake size per play, whereas slots it is more distributed across the whole spectrum, with the highest point being around 75%. Again, this is expressing quantile because I could not present the exact stake amount in this slide. And we did the same thing with the, this was the average potential return per bet. And this is the entire activity types of betting activities. And you can see that the golf is just a bit more higher average potential return per bet than the rest of the activities. Perhaps this reflects back to the type of the demographics that they attract. So golf, if you remember, attracts the higher age groups. So perhaps they have the capability to spend more and risk more, and therefore wish for higher potential return per bet. Maybe that's why golf has a higher value compared to others. And one more last thing, average session duration in seconds. So seeing if the duration of play differs by different activity types. And again, you see these differences across the group. Slots and poker, for example, have a relatively higher average session duration in seconds. So slots, the median is around 1,000 seconds, which is around 17 minutes. Poker is at the median is around 2,000 seconds, which is around 35 minutes. Some are lasting for almost 3 hours in poker. Some are very quick, such as in bingo. but it is slightly concerning that slots have a quite high average session duration in seconds, because slots tends to be rather quick compared to poker, yet people are playing in longer durations. Perhaps that is telling that slots attracts more at-risk gamblers. Now we're interested in looking at the temporal differences between how these activity types are played. We have plotted a calendar heat map showing the participation spread, if that is focused, concentrated in a particular day of the year or not. Football, for example, on the top left, you can look at that there is a lighter color on Saturday, which might reflect the Premier League that is going on every week on Saturday, and it is reflected by the gap between June and July, where the Premier League is off. Horse racing, that is on April, the high participation concentration on April, reflecting most likely the Grand National. Combat sports tends to be also quarterly events, whereas greyhounds tends to be bet throughout the year, as you can see on the second row on the third column. So below the line is the gaming, and above the line is above the line is the gaming betting, and below the red line is the gaming activities. And you can see slight difference how the bottom plots tends to be distributed more equally, indicating that perhaps gaming is played in a particular cycles, whereas gaming is more played throughout the year, especially slots, poker, for example. We have done a similar thing with hours of the day now. Similar pattern persists. Game betting activities have a particular time of the day where it has a high participation rate, whereas the gaming activity types, they are more relatively spread out, except for bingo, which is focused on Saturday morning time. Perhaps that's how bingo is played. We're not really sure, but this is what the data shows. So using this data set, we have I want to come back and highlight also that we've looked at how different activity types attract different demographics, but also different activity types present different ways that online gamblers participate in these events. So there's a lot of varieties in how it's played. So even if average session duration is 100 seconds, for example, you cannot determine if that is risky or not unless you determine what activity types these customers are tending to play, because they differ naturally by different activity types. Now, looking into the 37 variables that we've identified, we want to see if we can find out any typology of online gamblers from these variables that we've identified. We're going to be looking at 2 variables at a time here, just to explore. This is a scatter plot aggregated in hexagons, just to prevent overplotting and also to hide the individual points. This is comparing if gambling frequency correlates at all with gambling variability. We hypothesized that the higher frequency they play, the less gap they tends to play. And that is shown on the right bottom, where gamblers with proportion of gambling activities higher than 70% have a very low average gap between gambling days. But that is natural, because the more that you play, naturally, the less gap you will have. What's interesting here is on the left, where you can see there is a wide spectrum up on the y-axis for those that have played infrequently. So there are some players who has played infrequently, but with very low variability, meaning that they may be characteristic of some binge playing at certain times of the year. However, if you go up the higher end of the spectrum in y-axis, those are, I would say, less concerning patterns of play, where they are playing infrequently and also with very one-off variability. So they can be characterized as perhaps one-off gamblers. Now we can look at different variables. So this is gambling frequency and intensity, seeing if higher frequency, they tend to bet in a higher intensity or not. So for an intensity measure, I selected the average monthly deposit amount. Again, on the y-axis, I can only show expressed in quantile. So there seems to be a positive correlation between the two variables. The higher frequency one gambles, they tend to put in more deposit amounts in general. However, what's interesting is on the right end spectrum on the x-axis, where you see a variety of more spread across the y-axis. So these indicate perhaps there are some gamblers who bet almost every 1 to 2 days, but they still play in a very reasonable amount. So they play less than the median. They deposit less than the median amount every time, every month. So perhaps there are these group of online gamblers who are just casually playing with the amount that they can sustain. But nevertheless, the top right corner of this plot is indicating the most risky gamblers who plays almost every day and also puts in deposit very high amount. Now we also look at the different intensity measure, proportion of lost days. So how many days that they've played, what proportion of the day that they played did they end up losing? Similar trend, the more you play, sorry, not similar trend, the more you play, you tend to lose slightly less. So it's quite interesting that on the left side of the plot, those who play infrequently tends to have a higher proportion of lost days. Perhaps these are type of the gamblers who participate in these big events and doesn't really care about losing as much as the ones that play more frequently. Between 50 to 70% of the proportion of gambling days, that those that play nearly every 2 days or 1 to 2 days. It's interesting that actually a lot of the proportion of the customers actually end up winning. If you can see that there are some that is below the 50% of the proportion lost days. So one, they are managing the deposit amount very well, and also they're end up winning. But again, there are some worrying spectrum of these customers at the top right who plays frequently and who almost always lose. Now we're looking at gambling frequency versus the riskiness of play. In terms of the riskiness variable, we selected the monthly loss to deposit ratio. So that is on average, on monthly average, how much they lose from their pockets and how much they put in from their pockets. So ratio of 1 will indicate that they are losing the exact amount as they deposited. Less than 1 indicates that they are losing a bit less than they deposited. What's concerning is the value above 1, indicating they're losing more than they've deposited. There are actually substantial amount of customers who have monthly loss deposit ratio of 0, which indicates that they simply, on average, didn't lose. Again, that is focused on the customers who play very frequently, 50 to 75% of their gambling active days. We've taken them out and we've just focused on those that actually made some loss. So you can see that similar pattern persists from the before. Those that play infrequently tends to be focused on the monthly loss deposit ratio of 1, indicating that perhaps they lose everything they deposit, but perhaps that is because they're one-off gamblers. Maybe they participate in one major event and they just maybe perhaps don't care as much of losing what they deposit. But if you go to a more frequent gamblers, you can see that they're losing a lot more, less than the median of 0.54. But yes, I have only focused on the bottom spectrum, but what we should, and what I'm most interested is the customers above monthly loss deposit ratio of 1, who are actually losing more than they deposit. Yeah, so there are investments. So for example, they put in a deposit and they win throughout some events, and that win money will go back into the accounts and they reinvest that win amount to another, and they end up losing. And another explanation is for those that has been registered before 2022, they have already had that credit. So they have used that amount reinvested into the game, and then they are losing. That's why you see this imbalance between how much they lost and how much they deposited. So the further analysis that I've done, so using this data, using this account registry information, I also have a data on customer address as well, which will allow us to link to external data sources and look into further and characterize who these online gamblers actually are. So what we did was geodemographic analysis. What is geodemographic analysis? It's the analysis of people by where they live. And in this study, we have decided to use 2021 Apple area classification, which is created by one of the colleagues from UCL. The granularity is an Apple area level. It's I believe it was 20 different groups, distinctive groups that characterize the neighborhood at scale using a different combination of sensitive variables. So they use 60 census variables to create these 20 distinctive upper area classification groups to best describe that neighborhood. So what I wanted to do was to profile these online gamblers against these 2021 upper area classification to try to identify if there was any concentration in particular groups that from this OAK classification. How did I do that? I have calculated an index score. Index score, this is essentially how concentrated online gamblers are in a particular upper area classification group compared to the England and Wales average. I use only England Wales here because 2021 upper area classification is relatively new and data for Scotland is not out yet. So this is the results that we can see. So the one that is above 100 indicates that there are higher concentrations of online gamblers in this particular group compared to the national average. And the lower than 100 indicates that there are lower concentration of online gamblers in these specific groups compared to the England and Wales average. What you can see here is on the right-hand side is the groups that have a high index score. For example, the young families in industrial towns, routine occupations or retirement, established but challenged communities, and legacy industrial and coastal communities. These are the groups that were identified to have the most concentration of online gamblers in general. Whereas if you look at the left side of the plot, spacious rural living, those identified as student living in professional households, diverse educated urban singles. These are the online gamblers. These are sort of the areas where you would least likely to see online gamblers. I want to highlight that there seems to be a correlation between socioeconomic class and uptake in online gambling. And I have done some statistical analysis, precisely multi-level regression model, to see if that relationship between the socioeconomic class and the online gambling uptake relates or not. And if it does relate, does that differ by different areas in the UK? I've done that, but I have excluded from this slide. This is something I'm working on at the moment. So concluding remarks. So one of the main takeaways from today's slides are that activity types does matter in online gambling because it attracts different demographics and it influences different patterns of play. So what this means is that one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to policy making and when it comes to intervention, one-size-fits-all approach is insufficient when you want to really understand and tackle online gambling. And this highlights the importance of using the consumer data because as I have highlighted in the beginning, you really need to go deep into different activity types. In order to do that, you will need this level of data to look at, which is enabled by this consumer data. And to do that, you also need a high sample size because you're looking at the subgroup of the population, which becomes difficult in survey data. Another point from my presentation is that the gambling behavior is multidimensional. So we need to really account for this complexity to really understand gambling behavior. So in the scatter plots, we've just compared two variables at a time, but just by looking at the two variables, we were able to infer some different types of gamblers and different behaviors. But what will be interesting is to account for all of these different 37 variables that reflects these 4 key themes, putting into a washing machine, i.e. clustering analysis, and trying to identify different typology of gambling behavior. This is something that I'm working on at the moment, and what I believe to be very important because it accounts for these different dimensions of how people participate in online gambling. Now I want to highlight some of the novelties and implications of this research. So this research looks at individual customers, not accounts. I want to highlight that because there has been recent increase in the studies around online gambling that looks at consumer data, but most of them actually look at individual accounts, not individual customers. What's the difference? Individual customers may hold multiple accounts across different brands. But in my studies, I have linked all of them up and looked at individual customers at the same time, which allows precise assessment of individual gambling behavior. I would like to note here, acknowledge that there is a limitation as well, that I am only looking at one operator, which means that I cannot look at how these customers play in different contexts. Second, data availability for full year. So I'm looking at the entirety of 2022 and in the most granular format, which is from transaction level. I believe this is very important to conduct a study full year because as we have seen, there are, especially when it comes to sports betting, it really depends on whether there's an event that's going on, was there any particular promotion that's going on throughout the year, and that timings differ by different activities. So to have a comprehensive idea, I believe that having that full year is quite important. And to have the most granular format, it allows comprehensive insights into patterns of play. So there are some variables that it would not be possible to get if it wasn't for the transaction level. For example, the variability of play, you would need the most granular level of data in order to calculate the statistics. And finally, customizers information. Having this allows us to conduct some geographical analysis, which can be used to target and messaging and effectively allocate resources and have some public health interventions. This is the main ultimate aim for my thesis, is to conduct and create this so-called risk map using the risk measure that we have identified using these consumer data variables that is open scrutiny and it's transparent. And that will allow us to prevent harmful online gambling. So what's next? Next, what we're going to do is to use those variables that we have identified, and we will try to create a topology of online gamblers in Great Britain using k-means clustering. After that, we will be creating a GB-wide risk mapping based on our definition of at-risk gamblers. How we're going to do that? Spatial-based regression model, so which allows us to map the relative risk and exceeds the probability at the LSOA level. So at a very small geographical scale, we are able to map the risk Great Britain. And what I would want to do afterwards is to compare my definition of at-risk gamblers with the survey identified at-risk gamblers and also self-reported at-risk gamblers, to challenge the conceptualization and existing measures